There are moments in history when the darkness hiding beneath the surface of ordinary life tears through with such violence that it changes everything we thought we understood about human nature, about community, about trust. And in the summer of 1969 in California, when the air smelled of jasmine and possibility, and the counterculture promised freedom from the constraints of the past, that darkness found its voice in a man who understood that the most dangerous weapon is not a knife or a gun, but the human mind bent toward destruction. And this is the story of how one person's twisted vision turned a group of young seekers into instruments of unspeakable horror. Welcome to Crime and Prejudice, where we explore the psychology behind the headlines. And if you're drawn to understanding the depths of human behavior, please subscribe, because we bring you stories that matter. Stories that remind us why we must remain vigilant. And this particular story begins not with violence, but with emptiness. The kind of emptiness that makes people vulnerable to anyone offering meaning. And Charles Manson, born in 1934 to a teenager who didn't want him, grew up unwanted, shuttled between relatives and institutions, learning early that survival meant manipulation, that love was transactional, that the world owed him something it would never give. And by the time he reached his 30s, having spent more than half his life behind bars for petty crimes and theft, he had become something peculiar. A small man with penetrating eyes who had studied Dale Carnegie and Scientology and the Bible and anything else that might teach him how to read people, how to find their weaknesses, how to make them need him. And when he was released from prison in 1967, he reportedly asked to stay, because the outside world had changed so much it frightened him, but they released him anyway into the heart of San Francisco's summer of love, where young people were rejecting their parents' values, experimenting with drugs, seeking enlightenment, seeking belonging, seeking anything that felt more real than the suburban conformity they'd fled. And Manson, with his guitar and his rambling philosophy, found them easy prey. These middle-class runaways and college dropouts who saw in his intensity something profound when really they were looking at a mirror that reflected their own desperation back at them. And he gathered them slowly at first. Young women mostly, vulnerable and searching. And he told them they were special, that he saw in them what no one else could see. And he offered them a family because that's what they all lacked. A sense of belonging that felt unconditional, even though every condition imaginable was being woven into the fabric of their new life together. And they moved to Spawn Ranch, an old movie set in the desert where everything was already a facade. And there, in the heat and isolation, Manson's control deepened through sex and drugs and endless talking, his voice filling every silence until his followers couldn't hear their own thoughts anymore, couldn't remember who they'd been before they met him. And he spoke of revolution and apocalypse, of a coming race war he called Helter Skelter after mishearing Beatles lyrics and deciding they were coded messages meant specifically for him, which tells you everything about his delusion, but nothing about why intelligent people believed him. And the answer is they didn't believe all at once. Belief came gradually, in small concessions, in the surrender of one boundary after another, until there was nothing left to surrender except their capacity for independent moral judgment. And Manson told them the black community would rise up and slaughter the white establishment, but would be unable to govern themselves and would turn to him, to Manson, to lead them in the new world, a fantasy so absurd it should have collapsed under its own weight, except that he'd created an environment where reality itself had become negotiable, where his word was the only truth that mattered. And when the revolution didn't come on its own, he decided to start it, to commit murders so brutal and bizarre that they would be blamed on black militants and ignite the war he'd prophesied. And on August 8th, 1969, he sent 4 of his followers to a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, a house he'd been to before when it was occupied by a music producer who had rejected him, rejected his music, rejected his dreams of fame. And though that producer no longer lived there, Manson knew the house, and that was enough. Revenge and apocalypse blending together in his fractured mind. And the people who lived there now were Sharon Tate, a beautiful young actress 8.5 months pregnant, and her friends, people who had nothing to do with Manson, who didn't know he existed, who were simply living their lives on a warm California night. And what happened in that house over the next several hours was horror of a kind that still feels impossible to fully comprehend. Not because of the violence itself, though that was savage, but because of the coldness with which it was carried out by people who hours before had been eating dinner and talking and living as if they were part of something holy. And Sharon Tate begged for her baby's life and was told they had no mercy for her, and the word pig was written in blood on the front door as if human beings were nothing more than symbols in Manson's deranged narrative. And the next night, because apparently one massacre wasn't enough to start a revolution, Manson himself led a group to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a middle-aged couple chosen essentially at random. And again the violence, again the words written in blood. And then Manson and his followers returned to the ranch and went to sleep as if they'd done nothing more significant than run an errand. And for 2 days Los Angeles held its breath, terrified, because these weren't mob hits or robberies gone wrong. These were seemingly random attacks on people in their homes. And the city that had represented glamour and possibility suddenly felt like nowhere was safe. And the investigation moved slowly at first, in wrong directions, until pieces began connecting, until someone talked, until the improbable truth emerged that these murders had been committed not by hardened criminals or political extremists, but by young people, by a family as they called themselves, by followers of a man who'd convinced them that murder was not just acceptable, but necessary. And when they were arrested, some of them smiled, some of them sang Manson songs. And Manson himself performed for the cameras, crossing his eyes, carving an X into his forehead, turning his trial into theater because he'd always wanted to be famous, and if he couldn't be famous for his music, he'd be famous for this. And his followers maintained their devotion through the trial, sitting outside the courthouse, mimicking his ex scar, insisting he was innocent, insisting they'd acted out of love. And the trial lasted months, became a spectacle, and Manson would shout at the judge, would ramble about philosophies that made sense only inside the closed system of his own delusion. And what became clear during that trial was not just that he'd ordered the murders, but that he'd created a reality so complete, so totalizing, that his followers had lost the ability to see him clearly, to see themselves clearly, to access whatever moral compass they'd once possessed. And the prosecution argued that Manson had commanded these murders as surely as if he'd wielded the weapons himself, that his control over his followers constituted a form of action, and the jury agreed, found him guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. And he was sentenced to death, though that sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. And some of his followers also received life sentences, and they would come up for parole over the years, and some of them would express remorse, would struggle to explain how they'd become capable of such acts, would describe a fog they'd been living in, a reality that existed only within the walls of Manson's influence. And others would remain devoted to him even decades later, would insist he'd been misunderstood, which tells you something about the enduring power of the lies we tell ourselves when facing the truth would mean confronting who we really are. And Manson himself never showed genuine remorse, never took responsibility, continued to speak in riddles and half-truths, continued to blame everyone but himself, society, his childhood, the people he'd killed for being in the wrong place. And he gave interviews from prison where he'd ramble and provoke and occasionally say something that sounded almost profound until you realized it was just word salad, just the performance of depth, and people remained fascinated with him, with the case, with the question of how this happened. How could it happen? And that fascination itself became troubling because there's a fine line between trying to understand evil and being seduced by it, between analyzing a monster and making him into something more than he was, which was a damaged person who damaged others, who found vulnerable people and exploited them, who turned their need for meaning into a weapon against themselves and others. And Sharon Tate's family would spend decades advocating to keep Manson and his followers in prison, would attend every parole hearing, would ensure that their daughter and sister and grandchild were remembered as human beings and not just as victims in a famous case. And the members of Manson's family who did express genuine remorse would have to live with what they'd done, with the knowledge that their need to belong, their willingness to surrender their judgment, had resulted in the deaths of innocent people. And some of them would speak out years later about the mechanics of control, about how easy it is to lose yourself when someone offers you certainty in an uncertain world, when someone offers you purpose even if that purpose is destruction, and the case became a symbol of the end of the 1960s innocence. The death of the hippie dream, proof that not everyone seeking enlightenment was gentle, that communes and alternative lifestyles could mask something dark, that love and peace were slogans that could be twisted into their opposites. And Manson died in prison in 2017 at the age of 83, having spent more than 4 decades behind bars. And even in death, the fascination continued. Documentaries and books and endless analysis. And some of his followers remain imprisoned, and some have been released. And the debate continues about justice and punishment and whether people can truly change, whether someone who committed such acts under another's influence deserves eventual freedom. And there are no easy answers because the case itself resists simplicity. It asks us to hold multiple truths at once. That the followers were victims of manipulation and also perpetrators of murder. That Manson was both a product of a broken system and responsible for his choices. That society's failures don't excuse individual evil. And what haunts about this case is not just the violence, though that's haunting enough, but the ordinariness of the people involved. These weren't inhuman monsters. They were people. Young people who made choices that compounded over time until those choices became irreversible. And if we're honest, the question that keeps us coming back to this story is the uncomfortable one. Could it happen to me? Could I, under the right circumstances, under enough pressure and isolation and manipulation, lose myself so completely? And most of us want to believe we're immune to such influence, that we'd see through someone like Manson, that we'd walk away. But the truth is that everyone is vulnerable to something. Everyone has needs that could be exploited by someone perceptive enough and cruel enough to do so. And this story is based on real events and is shared for educational and informational purposes. It is not intended for viewers under 18 and does not glorify violence in any form. Please watch responsibly. And what we're left with after examining this case is not a comfortable lesson or a simple moral, but a reminder that the capacity for evil doesn't announce itself with horns and a tail. It arrives in the form of someone who claims to understand you, someone who offers you exactly what you're missing. And the question we have to keep asking ourselves is, what are we missing? What emptiness in our lives might make us vulnerable? Because the alternative to asking that question is believing we're immune. And history shows us again and again that no one is immune, that the darkness isn't somewhere out there waiting to invade us. It's a possibility that lives in everyone, dormant until circumstances align, and the most we can do is stay vigilant, stay connected to our own moral center, stay willing to question authority, especially the kind of authority that demands we stop questioning. And maybe that's the real lesson of Charles Manson and his family. Not that evil exists because we already knew that, but that evil succeeds when good people surrender their judgment, when they trade their autonomy for belonging, when they allow someone else's vision to replace their own. And in the end, Sharon Tate and her friends and the LaBiancas died not because they did anything wrong, but because they existed in the path of someone's delusion. And that randomness, that senselessness, might be the most terrifying thing of all. The knowledge that we cannot fully protect ourselves from the broken people among us. The knowledge that sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time is enough. And so we remember them. We say their names. We ensure they're not just footnotes in a story about a cult leader, but people who mattered, who were loved, who had futures that were stolen from them. And we remember, too, the young people who destroyed those futures, who surrendered themselves so completely that they became instruments of murder. Because their story is a warning about the price of belonging at any cost, about the danger of leaders who offer certainty, about the responsibility each of us has to guard our capacity for independent thought. And that might be the only meaning we can salvage from such meaningless violence, that we must remain ourselves, must retain our ability to say no, must never love any ideology or person more than we love our own humanity, because the moment we do, the moment we decide that someone else's truth matters more than our own conscience, we've taken the first step down a path that leads to places none of us want to go. And the difference between those who walk that path and those who don't isn't always intelligence or education or strength. Sometimes it's nothing more than luck, circumstance, the accident of who we meet when we're vulnerable, and that should humble us, should make us less quick to judge and more quick to protect, to look out for those who seem lost, to offer connection that doesn't demand surrender, to build communities based not on the worship of leaders, but on the respect between equals. Because Manson's family wasn't destroyed by law enforcement or by society. It was destroyed by its own contradictions, by the inevitable collapse that comes when human beings try to live as if one person's mind can replace everyone else's, as if surrender is the same as enlightenment, as if love can coexist with absolute control. And it can't, it never could, and the bodies left behind prove it. And maybe the most honest thing we can say about this case is that it reveals something we wish weren't true, that the monster isn't always the one who looks like a monster, that evil often comes wrapped in offers of belonging and purpose, that the things we most desperately want, love, meaning, family, can be weaponized against us. And the only defense is awareness. The only protection is skepticism. Not cynicism, but healthy skepticism. The willingness to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. The courage to walk away from communities that demand we become less than we are. And that's hard because we're social creatures. We need each other, but we need ourselves too. Need our own minds, our own judgment, our own capacity to distinguish between a teacher and a tyrant, between inspiration and manipulation, between love that builds us up and love that tears us down. And Charles Manson understood all of this, understood it, and exploited it. And that's what makes his story not just a historical curiosity, but a permanent warning. A reminder that the human need for connection will always create opportunities for those willing to exploit it. And our only hope is to stay awake, to question, to hold on to ourselves even when someone promises that letting go is the path to enlightenment. Because it isn't, it never is. And the evidence is written in blood on the walls of houses where innocent people died because they represented nothing except themselves, because they were symbols in someone else's narrative, because their humanity mattered less than a delusion. And we honor them by refusing to let their deaths be forgotten, by refusing to romanticize their killer, by insisting on the truth which is ugly and uncomfortable and resistant to simple explanations, by remembering that every victim was a person with dreams and fears and people who loved them. And every perpetrator was also a person who made choices. Terrible choices, choices that cannot be undone. And in the space between those two truths, we find the real horror of this case. Not the violence itself, but what it reveals about how fragile we all are. How quickly the ordinary can become the nightmare. How much we depend on each other to remain human. To remind each other of our obligations to something larger than our own desires or our own pain. And when that web of mutual obligation breaks, when someone steps outside it and convinces others to follow, the result is chaos, suffering, death. And the knowledge that it could happen again is happening again in different forms. Will continue to happen as long as there are people seeking meaning and people willing to provide false meaning for their own purposes. And that's the truth we have to carry. Not comfortable, not reassuring, but true. That the capacity for both good and evil lives in everyone, that circumstances matter, that we must guard against the moment when we decide someone else's certainty matters more than our own doubt. Because doubt is healthy, doubt is human. Doubt keeps us from becoming the kind of people who can kill without remorse because someone told them to. And in the end, that's all that separates us from them, the willingness to doubt, to question, to retain our humanity even when surrendering it seems easier. Even when the world offers us gurus and leaders and certainties that promise to take away our burden of choice. Because that burden is what makes us human, the weight of our own decisions, the responsibility for our own actions, and anyone who offers to take that away is offering not freedom but slavery, not enlightenment but blindness. And the test is whether we can see that in the moment, whether we can resist the seduction of surrender, whether we can hold on to ourselves when everything in us wants to let go, and most of the time we can. Most people do, but some don't, and when they don't, the consequences ripple outward, destroy lives, break families, shatter the illusion of safety that lets the rest of us sleep at night. And we're left with questions that have no good answers, left with the knowledge that evil is real and ordinary and preventable and inevitable all at once. Left with the memory of a summer in 1969 when the darkness finally spoke, and what it said was so terrible that we're still trying not to hear it. Still trying to believe that it couldn't happen again. Knowing that it could, knowing that it will. Knowing that the only thing standing between civilization and chaos is the individual choice, repeated millions of times a day. to remain human, to see each other as human, to refuse the voices that tell us otherwise. And that's the story of Charles Manson and his family. Not a story about one man's evil, but a story about what happens when we forget who we are, when we let someone else define us, when we trade our judgment for belonging and discover too late that the price was everything.